All right, let's just jump right into it. Welcome to our explainer on imperial policy after the French and Indian War. So picture this. It's 1763. Great Britain has just won this massive, truly globe-spanning war against France, and they are now the undisputed supreme power in North America. Sounds like a total time for celebration, right? Well, yeah, but that victory came with a crushing, absolutely astronomical price tag. So today, we're going to look at how a massive British war debt sparked a rapidly escalating conflict with the American colonies. We're going to dig into exactly why Britain changed its taxation policies, how they tried to enforce them, and how colonial protests transformed from everyday shopping choices into a unified and eventually deadly resistance. So here's our roadmap for today. Think of it kind of like an escalation ladder. We're going to cover debt from the war, the Townshend Acts explained, comparing the core arguments, boycotts and colonial protests, the Boston Massacre, and then we'll wrap up with a quick recap and a final question.
All right, part one, debt from the war, the 1763 crisis.
It's pretty wild when you step back and look at how fast the relationship between the British Empire and the colonists just completely unraveled. Back in 1763, Great Britain gained almost all the North American territory east of the Mississippi. Huge win, right? But managing a suddenly massive empire was incredibly expensive. Fast forward to 1767, just 4 years later, and Parliament passes the Townshend Acts to desperately deal with this ongoing debt. A year after that, British troops are physically occupying Boston to maintain order. And by 1770, blood is spilled in the streets. A relationship that had been forged over generations literally fell apart in less than a decade.
To really understand why things spiraled so out of control, we need to meet a key figure. His name was Charles Townshend. He held a very specific, very powerful title in the British government, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Essentially, he was the official responsible for managing the entire empire's finances. When Townshend took on this role in the late 1760s, he had one primary mission, and it was crystal clear: extract the necessary revenue from the American colonies to pay down that massive war debt, and, importantly, to pay for the soldiers now stationed in North America.
Which brings us to part two, the Townshend Acts explained, taxing imports.
Parliament's big solution was the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767. This act placed duties, which is just another word for taxes, on specific consumer items. We're talking paper, paint, lead, tea, and glass. Now, the absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that these were everyday imported goods. The American colonies simply didn't have the manufacturing base to produce these items themselves yet. So it meant they had absolutely no choice but to import them directly from Great Britain.
Okay, it's time for our first pause check. Think back a few years prior to when Britain tried to tax printed paper directly with the Stamp Act, which, if you remember, caused a massive uproar. So why did Townshend suddenly shift his strategy to taxing imported goods at the ports rather than just imposing those direct internal taxes all over again? Well, here's the immediate reasoning. Townshend actually hoped these new duties wouldn't anger the colonists because they were technically external taxes. See, in 1766, Benjamin Franklin had literally argued before Parliament that colonists only objected to internal taxes, taxes applied inside the colonies, and that regulating commerce at the ports? Totally fine. Townshend and Parliament genuinely thought they had found the perfect, acceptable loophole.
But, it wasn't just about the taxes themselves. It was all about the enforcement. Townshend took some really strict steps to guarantee the empire actually collected this money. First off, this new revenue was used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges directly. Previously, the colonial assemblies paid those salaries, which gave them a lot of leverage. Suddenly, that financial dependency was just severed. Second, he created the American Board of Customs, basing it right in Boston to aggressively crack down on rampant smuggling. And third, customs commissioners were handed what were called writs of assistance, which were basically really broad search warrants allowing them to look for smuggled goods pretty much anywhere they suspected.
Moving on to part three, comparing the core arguments, a fundamental disconnect.
And this right here brilliantly illustrates the fundamental disconnect between London and the colonies. Let's look at it impartially. On one side, you have Parliament's argument. They had just fought a wildly expensive war to protect these colonies. So, logically, they believed they had the supreme authority to raise revenue and strictly administer their own empire to, prevent total financial ruin. On the flip side, the colonists argued that their traditional English liberties were under direct attack. Because they didn't have elected representatives sitting in Parliament, they claimed these taxes were an unconstitutional infringement on their natural rights. It was the classic battle cry, taxation without representation.
Now, these weren't just passing complaints that flared up and went away. They literally became the bedrock of the American identity. In fact, if we look ahead a bit to 1776, we see these exact grievances officially documented. The Declaration of Independence explicitly calls out the king with this line: for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury.
And that brings up our second pause check. We know exactly why the taxes without consent were hated, but look closely at that second part of the quote. Why were the new vice admiralty courts, which were set up to enforce Townshend's trade laws, so wildly controversial to the colonists?
The immediate reasoning for their anger was twofold. First, these courts entirely bypassed traditional English legal rights by trying suspected smugglers without a jury of their peers. That's a huge deal. Second, the system was, well, incredibly corrupt by today's standards. The judges were actually paid a percentage of the worth of the goods they recovered. I mean, think about that. They had a direct financial incentive to find people guilty. As you can imagine, leniency was extremely rare.
Section 4. Boycotts and colonial protests. The boycotts begin.
Because of all this, everyday shopping quickly became a massive political weapon. The non-importation movement mobilized regular citizens, especially women, as incredibly powerful political actors. Listen to this verse from a Boston newspaper in 1767. It's called Address to the Ladies. It tells women to throw aside your bohea and your green hyson procure a good store of the choice Labrador. So groups like the Daughters of Liberty were actively out there encouraging women to boycott imported British teas and luxury fabrics, urging them to spin their own rough, homespun cloth and brew local herbal teas instead.
And protest was happening across all levels of colonial society. The Daughters of Liberty leaned into economic boycotts like spinning that homespun cloth we just talked about. Then you had the Sons of Liberty, who often resorted to public intimidation. They'd publish broadsides in newspapers directly calling out and threatening local merchants who dared to import British goods. Meanwhile, formal political bodies like the Massachusetts legislature used political petitions. Samuel Adams famously wrote the Massachusetts Circular, a letter sent to other colonies arguing that taxes were unconstitutional and pushing for a completely united boycott. Naturally, Great Britain demanded they retract the letter, which of course only united the colonies even further.
Section 5. The Boston Massacre. Tensions boil over. Things got so heated that in 1768, Britain actually sent 4,000 armed troops to Boston just to deal with the unrest. To make matters worse, these soldiers often moonlit as dock workers, which created severe job competition with the locals. It was an absolute powder keg. And on March 5, 1770, it exploded outside the customs house. But, history is all about perspective. Paul Revere and the Sons of Liberty immediately circulated a propaganda engraving claiming the British soldiers engaged in a planned, ruthless murder of innocent, peaceful civilians. However, the corroborated historical context, backed up by actual eyewitnesses, showed that a very large, extremely unruly mob had surrounded the soldiers, hectoring them and throwing snowballs, rocks, and wooden clubs.
Which brings us to John Adams. Now, even though he was a strong, vocal supporter of peaceful protest against Parliament, Adams actually stepped up to defend the British soldiers in court. He famously argued to the jury, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts in evidence." He argued that the soldiers fired in self-defense against a genuinely dangerous mob, and importantly, a Boston jury agreed with those facts. They ended up acquitting 6 of the soldiers entirely and convicting 2 of a much-reduced charge of manslaughter.
All right, finally, Section 6. Recap and final question, concluding thoughts.
By the late 1760s, the economic pressure from those boycotts had so drastically reduced British trade that it forced Parliament to partially repeal the Townshend duties. They only kept the tax on tea, really just to prove they still had the fundamental authority to tax. So let's quickly recap our escalation ladder. The massive French and Indian War debt triggered Parliament to impose those external taxes on everyday goods. Britain then tightened enforcement with customs boards and vice admiralty courts that bypassed local juries. In response, colonists unified through massive economic boycotts and varying levels of protest. And finally, the military occupation meant to enforce all these laws, climaxed tragically in the Boston Massacre. I want to leave you with a transfer question to really chew on. We've seen how the colonists fought back not just with their words, but effectively with their wallets. So how does participating in a shared protest, like all agreeing to boycott imported tea or proudly wearing rough homemade clothes, help create a unified identity among incredibly diverse groups of people who previously didn't have all that much in common? Really think about how shared sacrifice builds a community. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep analyzing those stubborn facts.